Welcome to this third segment on understanding the Vatican II documents. In this segment, we're going to look at the 9 decrees that came out of the Council. I love to start with definitions because that ensures we're on the same page. So let's define what is a decree. It comes from a Latin word which means I judge, and decrees carry the force of law or rules within a church. We mentioned in the previous segment the 4 constitutions were the why and the what. What are the things that we're called to do? Why are we called to do them? And decrees really tell us how we are to accomplish the teachings that are in those 4 apostolic constitutions, as well as the 4 Gospels and all of the letters of Paul and all of the teaching since the first century. How are we to accomplish this? Because all of us want to live lives worthy of our calling. It's that deep burning inside of, I know there's something more I want to do. There's something I'm supposed to go out there and do. I mean, what was the reason I was born? What's the reason I have these particular gifts that other people don't have? Why can I do things that other people don't do? And these decrees help guide us in here's how to live, here's how to interact with each other, here's how to interact with people you may not necessarily like or understand. And this is the how-to. There are 9 decrees. 9 decrees. We're going to go through them in the order they were released, or using the church term, promulgated from Pope Paul VI from the second session of the Council in 1963 until the final session, session number 4, in 1965. The first decree released during the Second Vatican Council dealt with this idea of communication. We'd had motion pictures for a long time. We had had radio. It was pretty established. Television was really coming in and of its own in 1963 when this decree was released. And the Council Fathers, obviously being inspired by the Spirit, knew there was going to be more coming along. There had to be more technological advancements that would allow us to communicate in ways they couldn't even have imagined in 1963. But what this decree did is it taught how the church is to use this new social communication, how we're to use radio, how we're to use television, and the things that they couldn't even imagine being invented at that point. It also taught us how we are to help set the standard, which goes to the Pastoral Constitution, to set the standard of what's good communication. To say, porn, putting that out into the household, not a good thing. And the church needs to stand up and say, that's wrong. That over there, that's a good thing that we should promote. All of this violence and these games and this kind of thing, that's not something necessarily young children need to see. In fact, no one really needs to see that, but I can't infringe on your rights if you want to, but I can definitely teach you this is probably not something you necessarily want to see. And that is part of the how-to that comes out of this decree on social communication. The next decree that came out of Vatican II was the decree on the Eastern Catholic Churches. The Roman Catholic Church is called the Western Church. The churches that split away from, most of them split away from Rome at the Great Schism of 1054, we'll talk more about that for the next decree as well, those are called the Eastern Churches. Now, not all of them broke away, but some of them, they were at such a distance, they kind of formed their own traditions, lowercase t, in how they were supposed to do things. So they're slightly different than the way we do things here in the Western Church, but they stayed in union. Most of them stayed in union with the Pope. Now those that did separate came back and they wanted to be in union with Rome. We refer to these as particular churches within the official documents. So as you're reading through and you'll see they'll talk about particular churches, they're talking about the Eastern Rite churches. In the Eastern Rite, they don't have Mass, they call it the Divine Liturgy. And if you're really worried about, does this count for my Sunday obligation? Yes. If you go to a Divine Liturgy, if you happen to be lucky enough to have an Eastern Rite church around you, it would count for your Sunday obligation. If you look at the architecture of churches, the Western churches, we tend to have straight lines. Eastern Rite churches and even Orthodox Church, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, they tend to have rounded architecture. That's one way you can tell the difference between them. In addition to having that rounded architecture, they tend to use icons much more than we do here in the Western Church. But since the Second Vatican Council, you're starting to see more icons used in the Western Church as well. Some of our Eastern Rite Catholic brothers and sisters are struggling a little bit with their neighbors. This image is out of Egypt. And you can see that the Muslims and the Catholics there are not playing very nice together. The three main families of Eastern Rite churches are the Alexandrian Church, which relate back to St. Mark. So as he went out from Jerusalem and started preaching Christ to the world, he went to Alexandria. And the churches that formed there, which we just saw in that previous image, the Coptics in Egypt, they trace themselves back to St. Mark. The churches that can trace themselves back to the apostolic work of St. Peter and St. James, when they went to Antioch, are the Antiochian. Now it gets a little confusing with the last of the three family, which are the Byzantine ones. They trace themselves back to Constantinople, which is today Istanbul in Turkey, because there are also Byzantines that are Orthodox, that are not in union with the Church. So there are some differences there, but we do have Eastern Rite that are Byzantine, and we have Orthodox that are Byzantine as well. We'll talk about our Orthodox Byzantine brothers and sisters in just a few minutes. What this decree really did was it looked for reconciliation with the Eastern Rite churches. Some of them, our relationship wasn't as good as it probably should have been. So this decree came out and said, we as Roman Catholics are sorry if we've caused any problems in the past. We definitely welcome you in. You are our brothers and sisters. We are in union with you. We accept each other's sacraments. The 7 sacraments are the same inside of these, both Eastern and Western Rite. It's just that we do things a little bit different. But isn't that great? You can worship God in all kinds of different ways. The last thing that this decree did was it proclaimed equality between the Eastern and the Western traditions. They are equal with each other, though they are sometimes very different, and that's what makes it so exciting, is the great diversity, even within the Church, in ways to worship God and to experience this wonderful life that God has given us. The next decree that came out of Vatican II is the decree on Ecumenism, and this one was powerful when it came out, because what it said was we need to seek reconciliation with our separated Christian brothers and sisters. And up to that time, I mean, you had the Council of Trent, which had closed the windows on the Church to protect ourselves from the Reformers in particular, but we also kind of were still reeling from the bruises, even though it was almost, it had been over 900 years at that point, from the Great Schism of 1054. But what this decree said was, one, as the Roman Catholics, we're sorry for any problems that we've caused. We seek reconciliation, and we want to have union now with our brothers and sisters who believe in Jesus Christ. And again, in the mid-60s, when this came out, this was huge. This was very powerful in seeking reconciliation. But if you think coming out of World War II, that was a time where we needed reconciliation in the world. Not everyone was comfortable with it, even 50 years later, but it's something we definitely need to do. Within this decree, it defined our Catholic principles of ecumenism. We definitely want to be in union with you. We want to sit down and have dialogue with each other, but we're not going to give up our truths. We don't expect you to give up our truths, but let's find some areas where we agree on. Let's focus in on those areas. Let's work together in places that we can. Go out and be pastors to the world, both as Orthodox and Protestants, as well as Western Rite and Eastern Rite Catholics. It gave us permission to be able to have worship services together. And sometimes you'll see, or at least here in central Indiana where I'm at, we'll have Lutherans and priests will be gathered together, and we'll have ecumenical services, which is really kind of cool to be able to pull together, especially Lutherans and Catholics, after we're a couple of years away from the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And 500 years ago, could they ever have imagined a Lutheran minister and a Catholic priest having a service together and really enjoying each other's company and talking about what we have in common and ways that we can work together. There's a section in this decree that talks about our relationship with our Orthodox brothers and sisters. The Orthodox are those who split away in 1054 when the church was split between East and West. And these are the groups of churches that changed their liturgy, they changed their sacraments so that currently they could not be in union with Catholicism as we know it here in the Western Rite and in the Eastern Rite. Where the term Orthodox came from, one, it's a Greek word which means right believer. So you could say that Western Roman Catholicism is the Orthodox way, but that term was assigned more towards the Eastern churches, so that's why we refer to them as the Orthodox Church. Why exactly they were called that, I couldn't find the answer to that. A lot of people said, well, we think it's this, we think it's that, but we're not entirely sure. So somewhere 900 years ago, they got the name Orthodox, and it stuck. Many of the Orthodox trace themselves back to the churches that St. Paul formed. And as I said, they broke away in 1054. The Pope immediately at that point excommunicated all those who broke away. The Patriarch of, at that time, Constantinople, he excommunicated the Roman and the Eastern Rite churches. Right after Vatican II ended, or just towards the ending, the Patriarch and Pope Paul VI got together and they lifted those excommunications. At least after 900 years, we're not excommunicating each other anymore. The last major topic that the decree on ecumenism deals with is the separated churches and the ecclesial communities. The separated churches are the mainline Protestant churches, which includes Anglicans, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, those that followed a very similar path to Catholicism. They have the bishops, they have some sort of succession that is similar to the way that the Catholic Church works, but obviously there's some great theological differences. Ecclesial communities are Christians who don't fit in well with the separated churches or the particular churches or any other classification, so we call them ecclesial communities. These are Christians who don't have a lot of similarities to the Catholic Church, so we don't consider them a church, but more of a community. And we know those today as the non-denominational and the fundamentalist churches here in the United States. Probably in other parts of the world they have different types of titles, but that's how we know them here in America. And those are Christians, and God is working in those communities and doing incredible things, but they don't meet our definition of church, so we don't give them that title. We call them ecclesial communities. The next decree is the decree on the pastoral office of bishops, and this was basically the Council Fathers writing a decree for themselves. They looked at the dogmatic constitution of the church, which, as I mentioned earlier, has a very large section on the bishops, and they had all the why and the what out of that constitution, and this decree is the how-to. And one of the biggest how-tos that came out of this is a job description for the bishops. Now, they know what they're supposed to do, but here it is in black and white. This is exactly what the role of a bishop should be. And it also stresses the need of shared decision-making, which they use the term collegiality. Now, up until this point, by no teachings of the church or no decrees, bishops were somewhat separated from each other. They tended to, this is my diocese, and what happens in my diocese is my business, it's my responsibility, and I'm not going to necessarily talk to the bishop in the next diocese. I've got my work that I need to take care of here. And again, that wasn't something that came out of Rome. You must do it this way. It just kind of evolved over the years. And out of Vatican II, we realized, that's not necessarily a good idea, and it really is not something that the original church, the early church, did. As we know that the apostles were working together, working in common, they were communicating with each other on a regular basis. So this decree teaches the importance of the bishops working together. Here in the state of Indiana, we have 5 bishops, and they meet on a fairly regular basis to discuss the needs of the Catholic Hoosiers. In the United States, we have the United States conference of Catholic bishops, and they meet twice a year, and it's a collection of all of the bishops from all the dioceses here in the United States. They get together, they talk about issues that affect us, they have communication directly with the Vatican, and that's really ensures that nothing goes wrong necessarily within Catholicism in the United States. Every country has one of these conferences. This decree formally established the conferences. It also established other ways that we ensured that the bishops had plenty of support within their diocese, and then also that the bishops would come back to the Vatican on a fairly regular basis and meet with each other and talk about various issues, and those are called synods. There are ordinary synods, there are extraordinary synods, and they've been going on since Vatican II. Another decree directly related to the teaching of the dogmatic constitution on the Church is the decree on the adaptation and the renewal of the religious life. This decree urged the religious orders to return to their roots, which, as you recall from the previous lesson, Pope John the 23rd used the French word ressourcement to return to the roots, to go back to the original teachings of their founders, for example, in the Jesuits, to go back to St. Ignatius of Loyola, to understand what it was he wanted to do when he founded this order, what were the original purposes, because some orders over the century had kind of worked themselves away from their original purpose, which all organizations do. We constantly need to come back and say, why are we here? What was our original purpose? And this decree told the orders that they needed to do that. Go back. Why were you founded? And then look at why you were founded and adjust yourself based on the needs of the modern world. Augmento, which was another theme of Vatican II. So basically what this decree did, it's the Council Fathers saying to the orders, update, renew yourselves the same way that we as the Council Fathers are doing to the Church. The Council Fathers wrote two decrees that directly address the priesthood, and this is the first of the two. The decree on the training of the priest took a look at the rules that had come out of the Council of Trent some 400 years before, which established for the first time, here is one method for training up priests. And at Vatican II, we looked at that and said, well, maybe, that worked really well at that time, but let's let each one of the bishops' conferences come up with their own method of training up a priest. Here's the standard that we need to follow, that everyone in the Church needs to follow, but now each one of the conferences can kind of change things and adjust their curriculum based on their local needs. That wasn't allowed for had we been sticking with the model that came out of the Council of Trent. So it included a base curriculum within this decree and then allowed for each country, each conference of bishops to make changes as needed. This decree also encouraged priests to be trained more as pastors than administrators. And it also allowed for what now we have the parish councils, we have parish administrators, which we did not have prior to Vatican II. And because the priest training is not so much of being, you're in charge of the parish, you need to know all the finance, you need to know how to run a building. That's taught at the seminaries, but not near to the extent that it used to be, at least here in the United States. It also encouraged a continuing education of the priest. Prior to Vatican II, a lot of priests were given their bachelor's degree or their master's degree, and then once they left the seminary, they were done with their education. In fact, some of the bishops said that when they came to Vatican II, they were so excited because they hadn't been to school since ordination, so they were so excited to participate in a lot of the workshops that would occur at night during the sessions of Vatican II. And this decree on the training of priests really encourages priests to be constantly educated. If you look at the teachings of Christ, he's always focusing on the basics, and he tends to repeat it over and over again because we need that. We need to be reminded of the basics over and over again. So this is the decree on the training of the priesthood, which really set up how priests are to be trained the end of the 20th century and going into the 21st century. Now here's an exciting decree for us. It's on the Apostolate of the Laity, and apostolate means our mission. Our mission is the laity. What are we supposed to do in the Church? This is the first time a decree was written specifically for the laity in defining what our mission is. And we, every one of us, is to be a missionary right where we are. Here I live in suburban Indianapolis, so I'm to be a missionary to all the people that I meet here on my street. And how are we to be that? Is to be Christ to the people. We don't have to stand out on the street corner and hold up the Bible and, here's what Jesus Christ says. You can do that if that's what you're called to, but we're such better missionaries if we just live lives worthy of our calling, go out and be the people that Christ wants us to be. That's what the world wants to see. They want to see authentic. They want to see integrity. They want to see people who actually walk their talk. This is why understanding Vatican II is so important, mostly because of this decree. And this decree tells us that we need to be studying. We need to participate in the Mass. We need to understand what all the parts of the Mass are. We need to bring up our children to be fully engaged in the life of the church. We need to be the missionaries that I talked about earlier. And then we also need to be, as Pope Paul VI said, the bridge to the modern world. You think about, you're at a dinner party and all of a sudden your pastor shows up. All of a sudden everybody, put the drink away or something like, and you act different when the priest is around. And there are some places, and my pastor has said this to me several times, there are many places he can't go. Because as soon as he shows up, everybody puts on their, I'm being the good Catholic, or all they want to talk about is Catholicism at that point, because the priest is here. But when it's just us, the laity, and we're talking with each other, we talk differently, and we can talk about issues that we wouldn't necessarily talk about when the priest is there. So that's why we need to be aware of the teachings of the Church. For example, the big issue right now as I record this is same-sex marriages. What does the Church teach about this? Now we can spout off, here is the official teaching and it's in paragraph such and such of the Catechism. Okay, that's fine. But what does that mean? How does that change my heart? How could that change your heart? That's how we are to be Christ to each other, is in explaining from our heart, how do I relate to these people? How do I understand them? What would Christ do if he were here? And again, if they wanted a sermon, they'd go off to church or they'd go ask the pastor, but they're asking you as another human being, as a member of the laity, what do you think about this? And that's why it is so important, and it says in this decree that we need to study, we need to know what the Church teaches. Ultimately, what the Church teaches is what Christ teaches, and through His Holy Spirit. In the previous decree, I mentioned the importance of being a missionary to the world, and now we have a decree on the missionary activities of the Church. The whole Church is missionary. Every one of us, every person watching this is a missionary. I don't want to be a missionary. It's scary. It is. It's hard work. It's getting out there and living a life of Christ. It's not easy, but we can't just leave it for the orders, for the sisters and the brothers and for the priests, or the people that say, I'm a missionary, I've got my name tag on here, missionary. We're to be missionaries in all aspects of life, and I talked about that a little bit earlier. To be a missionary, we need to know the truths. I mentioned earlier about the importance of understanding the teaching, so we need to focus in on that. The decree on the ministry and the life of the priest is the second of the two decrees that deal with the priesthood, the first one being on the training of priests, which we talked about a little bit earlier. This one helps define the role of the priesthood and what their duties are, and it helps understand that prior to Vatican II, a lot of times priests were up here, even untouchable, they were just so far above the laity. Well, it kind of brought them down a little bit, not that priests are to be looked down upon, but helped understand this tie between the priesthood and the laity. See, while we can go directly to Christ, I can sit here and talk directly to Jesus and know that I'm going to be answered, I'm going to be listened to. I need a priest in my life. The way that we're called as Catholic Christians is we need the priest to help us to get to Christ. We need them for Eucharist, and we need them for confession. We also need them for the awesomeness that they are. Each one of these priests that God has given us, they all have unique characteristics. the gifts that this priest has been given by Christ. I mean, this person was brought into the world for the priesthood. They've accepted this very difficult calling, because also in this decree they talked about the importance of penance and celibacy and other Christian acts that are involved with the life of the priest. Being a priest is not easy, but you know, being married is not easy. Being a human is not easy. But God has given these priests incredible graces, and I need to participate in their lives to get some of those graces, and also to give them grace as well. Because my pastor just announced his retirement. He's been a priest for 50 years. He's been at our parish for 21 years. He says, I'm 76 and a half years old, because all the children come up to him and they say, oh, this is my half birthday, Father. But he says he has learned so much from the laity. And while he's had an incredible life as a priest, what he's learned from the laity means more to him than what he learned in the seminaries. He learned the cold, hard facts of theology. But when they're out working with the laity, that's where they really see Christ, is in us. So we are Christ to the priest, and the priest is Christ to us. We need each other. This decree helps them to understand that, and our decree, the previous one, that talks about our apostolate, and working with our priests and working with our bishops, helps each one of us to really understand what God wants of His church and how the Holy Spirit is going to work through us. You made it! 9 decrees. There's a lot of information in there, a lot of great theology, a lot of how to live the life to which we've been called. Those decrees help us to understand what the Council Fathers wanted us to know from the constitutions, and then even in the decree there's even much more teaching of how to live this incredible life to which we've been called. So I encourage you, as we're working towards our homework, and again, your homework assignment is going to be to pick at least one of the documents to read them, or to read through them, is to pick maybe a decree that you'd like to understand a little bit better, and what does it teach. And the Apostolate on the laity might be a good choice for you to understand who are we supposed to be as laity in the life of the church. In the next segment, we're going to talk about the 3 declarations. Of course, we'll start off with the definition of what are declarations, so we'll see you there.